On July 21st, 2024, an organization calling itself the American Communist Party popped into existence. With a 2-minute trailer of AI-generated imagery, the American Communist Party proclaimed to be a brand new Marxist-Leninist party ready to wage the fight for communism in the United States. And this seemed to be a formidable enterprise. A letter of declaration was published on Twitter showing a bunch of chapters of the Communist Party USA, the oldest and historically most significant Communist Party in the US, apparently defecting to the ACP. On the executive board of the new party were the online personalities Eddie Smith and Noah Kredovic of Midwestern Marx, Haz al-Din, and Jackson Hinkle. And the party already had a sleek new website ready to launch. However, very quickly, within the next few hours after the ACP launched, something a bit curious happened. A bunch of chapters of CPUSA who were listed as defecting to ACP took to Twitter to clarify that no, they were not joining the ACP, and harshly condemned the ACP as chauvinists and reactionaries. The ACP, in fact, has a lot of bad blood with the Communist Party USA. Their declaration letter is spent condemning CPUSA and proclaiming it no longer fit to lead American communism. They expressed grievance at how the party leadership rejected their interpretation of Marxism-Leninism and accused the leadership of breaking the party constitution to suppress dissent. And so they decided to go off and make their own party, the American Communist Party. So all this begs the question of what exactly is going on here. There are all sorts of schisms and sectarian squabbles on the radical left, but this situation seems a little different and unique. Even at a surface level, some of the leaders of the ACP are social media personalities with considerable audiences. Jackson Hinkle has almost 3 million followers on Twitter. Eddie Smith of Midwestern Marx has 300,000 followers on TikTok. Has 100,000 followers on Twitter. Rev Lascaris has almost 300,000 followers on Twitter. They seem to have a pretty decent amount of money. They're able to rent venues regularly for in-person events. Executive board members are able to regularly go on international trips. These guys are far more well-resourced than your typical communist or self-described communist party. The leaders of the CPUSA apparently disagreed very strongly with their interpretation of Marxism-Leninism, which begs the question of what that interpretation is. The ACP claims that they are the true and authentic Communist Party, unlike CPUSA, but CPUSA members were quick to condemn the ACP as reactionaries, which is a strong claim. Is this just a sectarian mudslinging, or is there any truth to this charge? Let's take a look at the most well-known leader in the ACP, Jackson Hinkle, a former progressive liberal and environmental activist who appeared in a Get Out the Vote ad for the Democratic Party in the 2018 midterms. Hinkle has since taken a radical and interesting turn in his politics. If you take a look at Hinkle's Wikipedia page, it says that he's a promoter of something called MAGA Communism, and references his self-description as an American conservative Marxist-Leninist. This just creates more questions. What the hell is MAGA communism? How can one be both MAGA and a communist? And how on earth can one be both a conservative and a Marxist-Leninist? Well, let's hear it from a self-proclaimed MAGA communist himself. In an interview on Chinese media last year, which Jackson Hinkle did with fellow MAGA communist Grayson Walker, Walker explained that MAGA communism is just the application of Marxism-Leninism to the particular conditions in America, and nothing more.
But the orienting spirit was to try and reinvent or rediscover the meaning of Marxism-Leninism in the American context. We don't see any real contradiction between the spirit of being an American and the idea of communism and what that means for America's working class. With MAGA communism, of course, we can go into this as this show progresses. The contradiction is only apparent. When you dig down to it, what we're doing with MAGA communism is no different than what Marxist-Leninists have done in every successful revolution in history. It's taking the ideas of Marxism and meeting the working class at the level of consciousness that it's currently at, which today is in MAGA. Now, that doesn't mean endorsing or tailing the most backwards elements of MAGA. It doesn't mean, for example, endorsing everything Trump says or Bannon and so on. But it means going down to the people and learning from them and working with them and trying to advocate oneself as a champion of the people.
And Hinkle runs on this theme, presenting himself as a communist who wants to liberate the American people.
I can see that the policies that Washington, D.C. has adopted and run with for the past several decades, since before I was born, are actually hurting the American people. I mean, whether it's our outsourcing of American jobs, whether it's the hyper-focus on Wall Street and financial capital, reigning above all else, reigning above manufacturing, like good jobs that our people need, whether it's the wars and the foreign policy. I mean, it's disgusting what the people who are leading our country are doing in our name.
So that's a MAGA communism. It's just a Marxism-Leninism, but applied to the American context, and with a dash of a patriotism. Phrased like this, it seems like a MAGA communists are still fully committed to the communist cause. They're just taking a different strategy and trying to appropriate the MAGA label to win over American workers who are drawn to MAGA and Donald Trump. This is what the ACP likes to portray when they're explaining their ideology to the uninitiated. However, is this really what MAGA communism is? When MAGA communists get tarred with the label of reactionary, when Wikipedia describes Hinkle as far-right, is this just a slander? Are people just misunderstanding their ideology? Well, for help answering this question, let's turn to an appearance Hinkle made back in 2023 on the Fresh and Fit podcast, hosted by Myron Gaines and Walter Weeks. Now, if you're familiar with the Fresh and Fit podcast, then you're probably already going, uh-oh. But for those who aren't aware, the Fresh and Fit podcast is a talk show which is known for having certain views about women and relationships, views which have led the show to be demonetized on YouTube. So what is Jackson Hinkle doing on this podcast? Is he challenging their views? Well, let's see. During his appearance, the conversation steered toward the topic of women. Now, I would show the clip of this exchange. However, the contents of this exchange are such that I am sincerely worried about this video getting into trouble for hate speech. Even though it's not me saying it, I still worry because YouTube has historically taken down videos for hate speech, even if the creator of the video is responding to said hate speech and not espousing it. So for 30 seconds, I'm going to put text up on the screen of the exchange and let you read it. And I'll have a link in my sources to a video file containing the exchange, which you can view and verify that the text I am about to put up is indeed accurate. So that appears to be one of the founders of the ACP, espousing views on women which are pretty reprehensible. This is a major red flag, to say the least. The communist movement has historically been feminist, and yet Hinkle appears to be not just misogynistic, but a radical, extreme misogynist. And we can assume by the fact that Hinkle remains on the executive board, and that seemingly no one in the party takes any issue with this, that this is a permitted opinion in the ACP. In fact, here's a woman named Slava Jalili, who is in the Politburo of the ACP, appearing to affirm these views. She doesn't appear to be bothered by Henkel's views on women, because she seems to largely agree. So again, these views are entirely accepted within the ACP. I'll give another example of a red flag, this time to do with Eddie Smith of Midwestern Marx. Last year, Smith went on the podcast of the far-right online personality Jake Shields. Jake Shields is a Holocaust denier and Nazi sympathizer, and he's pretty open about this. But Smith felt it was fine to go on his podcast for a friendly chat. When criticized for this, Smith just complained about cancel culture and said that while he may not agree with all of Jake Shields' views, he still respects Shields on a personal level. So thus far, we've seen that extreme misogyny and fraternizing with Nazis are totally allowed within the ACP. I'll give another red flag. This one is perhaps not as alarming as having friendly chats with Nazis, but it's still pretty indicative. There's a fake research collective called RTSG Research, which is associated with ACP and run by Rev Laskaris. During a Twitter argument, Laskaris tweeted, "I own suits worth more than your monthly rent. Please put the fries in the bag, bro." Which is an odd statement to come from one of the leaders of an allegedly communist party. For another red flag, we can turn to Haas's Twitter account, where he pinned a thread which begins with, "Why Marxism is not woke," above a long, opaque manifesto where Haas explains his interpretation of Marxist theory. Throughout this thread, Haas cites the Russian philosopher Aleksandr Dugin. This is very curious because Dugin, who I'll be talking more about later, is a far-right philosopher. Now, I don't think it's wrong to read and engage with right-wing philosophers, but Haas does more than that. Haas utterly adores Dugin, and so does Jackson Hinkle. He also adores Dugin. Why are two leaders of the American Communist Party such big fans of a far-right philosopher? And I'll give yet another red flag. Back in December, the ACP held an event where the party platform was introduced by Haas. You'll recall that the ACP launched last July, which means that all the way from July to December, the ACP lacked a formal platform. This is a bit curious. A platform is kind of important, and this only further fueled the suspicions of the ACP's ideological character. If the ACP were to theoretically come to power in America, what would they actually do? What are their policies? What is their program? Haas sought to dispel all the naysayers, presenting a platform which overall seems actually pretty decent. Cancel all debts, universal healthcare and education and housing, ending US imperialism. This is the stuff you would expect in a communist or socialist party program. Well, I guess we were wrong. It turns out the ACP is a genuine communist party. We were just being hysterical. But wait, let's take a look at the description. So far, everything seems good, but then... well, what's this? Promote American civilization. Reconstitute the USA into one united republic? What exactly does this mean? Here, Haas makes a curious reference to Canada.
We all love our country, which we know as the United States of America, though some of you live in Canada. In any case,
we all love our country, which we know as the United States of America, though some of you live in Canada. Laughter. In another event held a month later, where the Constitution of the ACP was adopted, another curious reference to Canada is made.
Our Constitution recognizes one Communist Party within the territory currently occupied by the United States and Canada.
And at another event last year, the podium which Haas gives his speech shows a map of what is presumably supposed to be this future ACP-governed America. And you'll notice that it includes both the United States and Canada. And over on Twitter, Jackson Hinkle has made statements like, "The war to liberate Canada will not be a war on the people of Canada. It will be a war to liberate Canada from the British globalists, and Manifest Destiny is not complete until the US liberates Canada. And why are we spending so much money on Ukraine when we can so easily complete Manifest Destiny and liberate Canada?" I'm sure many of you are already familiar with the concept of a Manifest Destiny, but for those who don't know, Manifest Destiny refers to the ideology of American expansion across the Americas, a process which included a genocide against the indigenous peoples. And in any case, it's a nationalistic American idea, so it's very strange that a founder of the American Communist Party is citing Manifest Destiny as a justification to invade Canada. This talk of spreading American civilization and completing Manifest Destiny and a war to liberate Canada makes it sound like the ACP isn't necessarily talking about a peaceful, consensual unification of the US and Canada. It sounds like they're saying that Canada will be part of the US whether or not the Canadians want it. The idea of annexing Canada is an old American imperial goal. The Continental Army attempted and failed to conquer Canada in the Revolutionary War, and the US tried again and failed during the War of 1812, and since then, there have been no serious attempts to annex Canada, and not that much talk about it. The idea, however, was recently revived by Donald Trump in his attempts to return to 19th century style American imperialism, and the ACP appears to agree. So now we have extreme misogyny, socializing with Nazis, flaunting wealth and mocking the poor, citing far-right philosophers, and calls for territorial conquest. These are all accepted within the American Communist Party, quote-unquote. This is all very strange, and it gets even stranger. I want to now turn to this speech by Haas. This speech is titled "The Occupied States of America," and offers a direct explanation of the MAGA communist worldview. Since the ACP proclaims itself to not only be Marxist-Leninist, but the one and true authentic Marxist-Leninist party in America, you would think that this speech elucidates the principles of Marxism-Leninism, right? Well, let's take a look.
And eventually, in the aftermath of the Civil War, almost every aspect of economic life became dependent actually on banking cartels. The law of monopoly, of the aggregation of various industries and forms of property, gave rise to the rise of centralization of banks and banking systems. And these banking cartels, rather than markets, were given total control over the success or failure of industrial and commercial ventures. See, a group of the wealthiest private bankers, led by J.P. Morgan, all decided that they were going to seize control of the reins of the economy. They were seizing control of the manufacturing, the transportation, the mining, the telecommunications, the financial markets. I should also add some added context here. This cartel of bankers, this cartel of monopolists, these weren't just wealthy Americans. These were people who had extensive relationships, blood ties, and even marriages with the British oligarchy, with the powers of old Europe. But according to him, it was a goal of this elite. He even formed a secret society toward that aim of recovering the United States of America as an integral part of the British Empire. Now, they haven't done that formally speaking, but in terms of the complete co-option of our institutions, in everything but name, it seems like it was pretty successful.
Now, if you understand anything about the ideas of Marxism, it's plainly clear that this is not Marxism. Marx's call for the abolition of capitalism, which is based upon the exploitation of the working class by the capitalist class. But Haas doesn't really talk about class struggle. He talks about a quote-unquote British financial cabal ruling America. He doesn't talk in terms of the capitalist class ruling over the working class. In fact, he seems to dismiss class struggle in an offhand manner, declaring that this cabal oppresses Americans across class, and he seems to suggest that class struggle is actually a distraction.
40% of your personal income taxes, I didn't know this until a few years ago. It actually shocked me. It doesn't go to welfare queens. It doesn't even go to corporations not paying their fair share, or whatever Bernie Sanders says. 40% of your personal income tax goes to paying interest on the national debt. They have us fighting each other about, if you're a little more rich, you should be paying more. Oh, it's these welfare queens responsible for our high taxes. How is nobody talking about the fact that nearly half of every dollar that we pay is going to literally nothing, right? It's going to the humiliation of us as a country and as a people.
And Haas repeats this theme over and over. In a Twitter thread from 2023, Haas says that MAGA communists oppose private property, which you would expect for communists. Communists have always opposed private property, though that term can be confusing and misleading. Historically, private property referred specifically to a social relationship where a private owner takes possession of property which is worked on by others. It doesn't refer to your toothbrush or television, which are personal property, but rather productive assets like machinery and tools, or land from which rent can be extracted. Essentially, it refers to the private ownership of capital and land, something which communists want to abolish in favor of public ownership. Haas says that MAGA communists want to abolish private property, but his definition of private property is a little different. As he says, everyone dreams of getting rich, but it is because you want to use that wealth for a specific reason. You want a yacht or a luxurious mansion, a nice car, etc. But private property in the form of capital is not any substantive real wealth, but money for money's own sake. As we can see today with the fiat currency and the outrageous speculations of the financial class, money has ceased to represent any real wealth at all, but takes the form of power. Power the banksters are using to implement their Great Reset agenda to enslave entire nations. Communists do not oppose wealth. They oppose the institution of private property, which subjugates the entire economy to an institution which is completely antisocial, anti-human, anti-civilizational, and in fact anti-wealth. Private property is not your personal possessions. It is not your car and it is not your home. It is not even your small business. Private property is the debt you pay to banks, with interest, for taking out a mortgage to be able to afford a home. Private property is the institution which mercilessly destroys families and societies, having no regard for any genuine human needs, and devoid of any human character. Private property is the institution of usury. It is on its basis that all civilization begins to break down, and even the most sacred relations of familial and communal bonds are destroyed as women enter into prostitution and men fall victim to suicide and drug abuse. So how do communists want to abolish private property? Communists do not advocate taking people's possessions. And in fact, we do not even advocate taking people's businesses. So according to Haas, private property doesn't refer to private ownership of the means of production. It doesn't refer to capitalist businesses. Rather, by private property, Haas means usury, which is destroying sacred relations of familial and communal bonds. Owning a business and getting rich, that's not a problem. The problem is the cabal of bankers who are bleeding the productive economy dry. That's the real enemy. In this thread, Haas uses the terms a capitalist class and a working class, but he's not using these terms in a Marxist sense. The capitalist class is not the actual capitalist class, but the international financial cabal. And the working class is the American people who have to unite across class to defeat the international financial cabal. This most definitely isn't a Marxism, but it does sound like another ideology. The struggle against international finance capital and loan capital has become one of the most important points in the program on which the German nation has based its fight for economic freedom and independence. His Majesty the Kaiser made a mistake when he raised representatives of the new finance capital to the ranks of nobility. Admittedly, it may be offered as an excuse that even Bismarck failed to realize the threatening danger in this respect. In practice, however, all ideal virtues became secondary considerations to those of money, for it was clear that, having once taken this road, the nobility of the sword would very soon rank second to that of finance. A serious state of economic disruption was being brought about by the slow elimination of the personal control of vested interests and the gradual transference of the whole economic structure into the hands of joint stock companies. In this way, labor became degraded into an object of speculation in the hands of unscrupulous exploiters. The depersonalization of property ownership increased on a vast scale. Financial exchange circles began to triumph, and made slow but sure progress in assuming control of the whole of national life. It is true that a section of the German industrialists made a determined attempt to avert the danger, but in the end they gave way before the united attacks of money-grabbing capitalism. Can you guess who wrote these words? Yeah, okay, Adolf Hitler. And Mein Kampf. This theme of an international financial cabal bleeding the productive economy dry through usury has been a staple of fascist ideology. The explicit anti-Semitism is missing from the ACP's rhetoric, and I don't think this ideology necessarily needs anti-Semitism, regardless of whether this international financial cabal is defined in ethnic terms. It's still fascistic ideology and rhetoric. America is occupied by a parasitic financial elite, which Americans need to overthrow to restore traditional values, rejuvenate the country, and engage in territorial conquest. That's fascism, not Marxism. It's not hyperbole to say that. That's not socialism. That's National Socialism. You'll notice too the presence of signifiers like the Great Reset, which is this right-wing boogeyman of the last few years. In their interview on Chinese media, Jackson Hinkle and Grayson Walker talk about such things as the Great Reset and George Soros and the World Economic Forum and Klaus Schwab. And this is all rhetoric customary to the far right, not the Marxist left. Far-right and fascist ideology also presents itself as resisting the powers that be. But instead of class struggle, it's conspiracy theories about international cabals trying to destroy the nation and traditional values. And that's exactly what characterizes the ACP's ideology. The ACP should not be treated as a communist party or a communist sect. The communism appears to be intentionally deceptive branding to lure in young, naive leftists dissatisfied with the mainstream left and tell them that, hey, this is the new Communist Party of America, join us. We hate capitalism, and by capitalism we mean international finance, quote unquote. So I want to explore this more deeply. Where exactly did MAGA communism come from? What's interesting about MAGA communism is that it's a distinct and novel far-right ideology. It isn't neo-Nazism, which is the most prevalent fascist ideology on the American far right. This is something distinct. And I think by exploring the history and origins of MAGA communism, we can glean some valuable insights about the nature of reactionary ideology. A major clue as to the origins of MAGA communism is in Haas's speech I showed before. When Haas discusses this international financial cabal which is occupying America, he describes it as British for some reason. This seems to make no sense. Is Haas saying that the US is controlled by Britain to this very day? That America is literally oppressed and occupied by a British elite? What does this mean exactly? Fascist rhetoric is often esoteric and not meant to be taken literally, so it's easy to guess that Haas doesn't literally think that a British elite rules America. But why does Haas use the word British to describe this international financial cabal? I think this is a clue to figuring out the origins of MAGA communism, and it takes us back to an obscure figure in American history. That figure is Lyndon LaRouche.
I think even for those that may disagree with LaRouche's philosophy, right, they must at least concede that he is probably one of the most, if not the most, profound theorist and thinker of policy in the modern age. What do you think about that?
When I was in middle school, I would go on this website, uselectionatlas.org, and browse historical American election results, because that's what I did when I was a kid. And I would see this name pop up over and over again, Lyndon LaRouche. I never bothered looking into who this is, not until last year, after the launch of the American Communist Party, when it became clear that there was some sort of association between the ideology of Lyndon LaRouche and the ideology of the ACP. A very good book, and the only in-depth book on Lyndon LaRouche, is Lyndon LaRouche and the New American Fascism by journalist Dennis King, who spent a long time covering LaRouche and his movement. So, Lyndon LaRouche was born on September 8th, 1922 in Rochester, New Hampshire, the oldest of 3 children, and was raised mostly in Lynn, Massachusetts. By his own account, LaRouche was a lonely child who was bullied often at school, and he claimed to have read numerous philosophers like Kant, Rousseau, Hobbes, Hume, etc. before the age of 14. LaRouche was raised in a Quaker family. If you're not familiar, Quakers are a Protestant sect long known for their commitment to nonviolence and philanthropy and social reform. But LaRouche's family was a little different. LaRouche's parents were not born Quakers. Rather, they became Quakers after LaRouche's father converted from Catholicism, and they were outliers in the Quaker community. LaRouche's father was a fierce anti-communist who attacked his fellow Quakers for criticizing the Axis powers during World War II, and the family had difficulty getting along with the rest of the Quaker community. Because of the troublesome behavior of his father, LaRouche's parents were driven out of the Lynn Quaker community and established their own group in Boston. Decades later, LaRouche's father would still hold a great deal of bitterness and was writing scathing attacks against the American Friends Services Committee, a progressive Quaker organization which advances anti-war and social justice causes, which naturally made LaRouche's father really hate them. After graduating high school and spending some time in university, LaRouche served in non-combat roles during World War II. He claimed that he was converted to Trotskyism by a fellow soldier while sailing home in 1946. And so, though LaRouche grew up in a far-right household, he would not embrace the far-right, not yet. Rather, he became involved in leftist organizing and joined the Socialist Workers' Party in 1948, a Trotskyist group which had been expelled from CPUSA. However, LaRouche's political activities would be few and far between in the 1940s and 50s. But in the 1960s came a new wave of political struggle, activism, and social unrest in America and around the world. And LaRouche, now in his 40s and living in New York City, enthusiastically participated. He was teaching classes on dialectical materialism and participated in the 1968 Columbia University protests, rallying his supporters under the name of the National Caucus of Labor Committees, or NCLC. In its inception, the NCLC was a small left-wing group which sought control of the Columbia University branch of the Students for a Democratic Society. However, over the next few years, it became a tight-knit organization of a few hundred people who became totally and utterly devoted to Lyndon LaRouche and his ideas, to the point of quitting their jobs and leaving behind their old lives to commit themselves full-time to the NCLC. LaRouche's ambitions for the NCLC dramatically widened. The organization now sought to take control of the trade union movement and seize political power in the United States. LaRouche's followers fully believed that they were capable of this, and even though they were almost all well-educated and from middle-class backgrounds, many of them with degrees from prestigious universities, they cut themselves off from their old lives to work 12 to 16 hours a day for meager pay in their devotion to LaRouche. If this sounds like a cult to you, yes, it very much was and is a cult. The NCLC still exists. LaRouche exerted extreme control over his followers, isolating and brainwashing them, and developing methods of psychological torture to keep them in the fold, and he kept them perpetually terrified by paranoid delusions about the CIA and MI6 coming after the NCLC. In the summer of 1973, LaRouche developed a paranoid fantasy that the CIA and MI6 had brainwashed an NCLC member and turned them into a Manchurian candidate in a plot to kill LaRouche and his wife. Any member who expressed skepticism of this story was liable to be kidnapped and subjected to a deprogramming session. Predictably, any member who expressed skepticism became immediately suspect. Christine Burl called the story hogwash and withdrew from any active role in the leadership. LaRouche said that the CIA, acting through her boyfriend, had taken over her mind. A friend warned her that a plot was afoot to kidnap and deprogram her, to liberate her from her brainwashed condition. They waited outside her door, but she didn't come out. Less fortunate was Alice Weitzman, also a skeptic, who was held captive in her apartment and forced to listen to Beethoven at high volume, a deprogramming technique suggested by LaRouche. Weitzman managed to throw a note out the window. A passerby picked it up and alerted the police. When officers went to the apartment, they heard screams, forced their way in, and freed her. Later that day, they arrested 6 NCLC members on kidnapping charges. The case was ultimately dismissed after Weitzman refused to press charges. So yeah, and in addition to becoming a cult, the group took a far-right turn politically in the 1970s. This was signified in September 1973 by the execution of Operation Mop-Up, where LaRouche's followers began violently attacking and breaking up the meetings of left-wing parties, including those of the CPUSA and LaRouche's old party, the Socialist Workers' Party, and Black Power activists. They wielded bats and metal pipes and nunchucks and violently assaulted a number of events and meetings for several weeks until the police cracked down. The rationale LaRouche used for Operation Mop-Up was to vanquish other socialist and communist parties and make the NCLC the dominant party on the left. But in fact, this was an indicator of the extreme right-wing turn the NCLC was taking. LaRouche founded the U.S. Labor Party in 1973 to act as the political arm of the NCLC, and was soon making contact with far-right groups like the Ku Klux Klan, the Liberty Lobby, and the segregationist American Independent Party. However, LaRouche would have difficulty forging an enduring alliance with the traditional far-right. LaRouche had many Jews and racial minorities in his organizations, and his brand of far-right politics was shaping up to be something different from traditional American far-right politics. But LaRouche and his followers were very much making a far-right turn. I'll read King describing this far-right turn. According to former NCLC members, the national office was briefed in May 1979 on how a military coup would make LaRouche dictator. The NCLC's right-wing allies supposedly would bring this about sometime before the 1980 election. Meanwhile, in a campaign speech, LaRouche called for the abolition of democracy and alluded to a plan for a march on Washington. The context suggested something like Mussolini's 1922 march on Rome. Whatever LaRouche might tell his followers to feed their sense of self-importance, he knew he could only establish his dictatorship if a leading strata of capitalists and governmental agencies were willing to sponsor it. LaRouche claimed that the world is dominated by a Zionist oligarchy, a cabal of international usurers with headquarters in London. This conspiracy has kept the nation subservient to London, enabling speculative capital to bleed dry productive capital through usury. The grand design begins with a total rejection of British liberal notions of democracy. LaRouche's own humanist republic would have nothing to do with elections of parliaments. It would be a class dictatorship, in fact, of the industrial capitalists, with labor leaders like the Teamsters as junior partners to provide a broader social base. Within this dictatorship, the interests of capital and labor would be understood to be identical, and strikes by labor unions would not be tolerated. The grand design's next stage is the total mobilization of the entire nation in preparation for total war. The ultimate aim of LaRouche's total mobilization would be world conquest. The United States should plan first for a war against Britain. While crushing Britain, LaRouche would carry out the unification of other Western nations by installing humanist regimes in each. Nuclear blackmail would be a helpful means to this end. With the entire West unified, purged, and totally mobilized, America would be ready to go after the last bastion of the enemy, the Soviet Union. This would not be a matter of a few bombs or a putsch. LaRouche believed that a war between the two superpowers cannot be less than total war, and that to win such a war, one would have to hit the enemy with an atomic, bacteriological, and chemical triple punch. Okay, I think you get the point. The NCLC and its political arm of the US Labor Party became fascist organizations. Their goal became to install a fascist regime in America with Lyndon LaRouche as leader and mobilize the country for a campaign of global conquest. LaRouche studied how Hitler and Mussolini came to power and concluded that he had to forge a coalition of American political, economic, and military elites willing to sponsor the overthrow of the American Republic and its replacement with a fascist regime with LaRouche at the helm. However, the conditions weren't there. The US of the late 20th century wasn't in a crisis like Weimar Germany or interwar Italy, so LaRouche never really had much of a chance of succeeding. He was never able to build a powerful fascist movement and never came close to seizing power, and the vast majority of Americans today have never heard of LaRouche. The crisis LaRouche needed never came during his lifetime. The US didn't experience a catastrophic defeat in war, nor was there a powerful, militant socialist and communist left, which American ruling elites feared enough to turn to a fascist like LaRouche. But even though LaRouche never came close to taking power in America, he got a lot further than you might think. LaRouche and his movement weren't just isolated cranks. Very far from it, in fact. They cultivated genuine, powerful connections. LaRouche and his followers raised $200 million and had the ears of very high-ranking government and military officials, all the way up into the Ronald Reagan administration, and even cultivated considerable connections with foreign governments. One way LaRouche grew his movement's influence was by turning the NCLC into partially a private intelligence service. which became very well regarded. LaRouche had hundreds of his followers working day and night on poverty wages to produce high-quality intelligence work, which helped to build LaRouche's connections in elite government and military circles. Dr. Norman Bailey, Senior NSC Director of International Economic Affairs, met several times with the LaRouchians in 1982-83, including at least 3 times with LaRouche. After leaving the NSC, he told NBC TV that LaRouche had one of the best private intelligence services in the world. Richard Morris, executive assistant to Judge William Clark, when the latter was President Reagan's national security advisor, met with LaRouche several times, and with LaRouche aides on numerous other occasions. He set up meetings for LaRouche with other top NSC officials. Such meetings could not have taken place without Clark's approval. In the mid-1970s, the LaRouchians tried to cultivate General Daniel Graham, chief of the Defense Intelligence Agency. Graham cited an instance when the LaRouchians provided sensitive information on Angola and Mozambique that was unavailable from normal sources. LaRouche also impressed some European intelligence officials. Intelligence experts in the late 1970s were amazed at his connections and his access to special information on terrorism, the drug scene, the intelligence services themselves, and on the details of developments in the East Bloc countries and in the Middle East. Through the years, the LaRouchians developed a reputation among investigative reporters as well as intelligence mavens for their access to occasionally stunning pieces of information. The best illustration is Executive Intelligence Review's scoop on important aspects of the Iran-Contra affair in the spring of 1986, many months before the major media learned about it from a Lebanese daily. Another way LaRouche cultivated influence was through something called the Fusion Energy Foundation. The FEF was an organization founded by LaRouche in 1974, which advocated research into fusion power for military purposes. It was able to cultivate extensive connections among fusion scientists and in military-industrial circles, and extensively lobbied the US government to increase support for research into the development of fusion-powered space weaponry. You'll recall that LaRouche believed in waging a global war of conquest, and if you're wondering if there's any connection between this and the Fusion Energy Foundation, yes, there indeed is. LaRouche saw fusion power as a potential means of developing wonder weapons, which his fascist regime could use to conquer the world and annihilate its enemies. The background of all this was the Reagan administration's Strategic Defense Initiative, or the Star Wars program, a proposed space-based missile system to defend the US from a nuclear attack. LaRouche and his followers were avidly in favor of the Star Wars program and lobbied for it, and wanted to go even further and build offensive space weaponry using nuclear fusion. There's a lot more to say about LaRouche. He cultivated connections among mobsters in the Teamsters Union. He went to prison for 5 years because he instructed his followers to commit massive financial fraud and scam a ton of people out of their money. And LaRouche turned his attention to electoral politics, and he and his followers began running for elected office and actually saw some measure of success. But I think you get the point. LaRouche was a fascist who cultivated connections in elite government, business, and military circles. Like Mussolini, LaRouche started as a leftist, but drifted to the far right. LaRouche might seem totally buffoonish, but I really do think that in a different timeline, had the conditions been different, he could have been the American Hitler. So that begs the question of why Hinkle and Haas seem to really like LaRouche. Nowadays, MAGA communists usually don't talk directly about LaRouche, and Eddie Smith from Midwestern Marx just outright denies that MAGA communists are connected to LaRoucheism in any way. But Haas and Hinkle are very much fans of LaRouche. LaRouche is one of the most profound theorists and thinkers of policy, According to Haas, and Hinkle has been associated in the past with the Schiller Institute, an organization founded by LaRouche's widow, which continues to promote LaRoucheite ideology. And even though Haas and Hinkle may now avoid directly mentioning LaRouche, LaRouche's influence is plain in their ideology and rhetoric. Recall earlier all this talk about the British quote-unquote ruling America, which both Haas and Hinkle have espoused. A British financial cabal occupies America. We have to liberate Canada from the British globalists. What's all this business about British globalists and British financial cabals? Well, it comes straight from LaRouche. British is a word LaRouche used all the time to refer to sinister, shadowy elements which he and his followers were supposedly fighting. He would refer to the British oligarchy and claim that Britain is the #1 enemy of the United States, and this usage of British has an even older history. During World War II, the Nazis fused anti-Semitism with anti-British sentiment, condemning English high finance and depicting the British Empire as the engine of Jewish rule. And this theme has persisted among neo-Nazis to this day. This is pretty clearly where LaRouche got the idea of British finance ruling the world. He just excised the explicit anti-Semitism and developed his own elaborate conspiracy theory to suit his particular brand of fascist politics. One must begin with LaRouche's conspiracy theory of history, which highlights the role of deception and concealment in the transmission of ideology through the centuries. In the secrets known only to the inner elites, LaRouche claims that he and his followers represent a 3,000-year-old faction of Neoplatonic humanists locked in mortal struggle with an equally ancient oligarchy. To avoid repression by the dominant oligarchy, the humanists through the centuries have concealed their ideas in much the way that an espionage agent conceals his identity. Indeed, the humanist is a combination of spy and underground organizer. LaRouche cites the example of St. Augustine, who supposedly adopted Christianity as his cover for organizing a united front against the oligarchy. LaRouche assures us that they destroyed all past societies they captured, from Atlantis through Rome. 3,000 years ago, their headquarters were in Babylon. After they engineered its fall, they shifted their command post westward to Rome, then Venice, and finally to London. Unable to stop humanist networks led by Benjamin Franklin and Friedrich Schiller from launching the Industrial Revolution, the oligarchs struggled to slow it down through their control of speculative capital, which allegedly feeds like a vampire on productive capital. But the oligarchs today are extremely worried because productive capital has begun to link up with the powerful, streamlined humanist conspiracy represented by the NCLC. According to LaRouche, human history is Assassin's Creed, and a malevolent cabal has been oppressing humanity for eons and struggling with heroic Neoplatonic humanists. And he claimed that this cabal today manifests as a British financial cartel which controls America and bleeds the productive economy dry. This is just a variation on the traditional fascist idea about secret financial cabals ruling the world and sapping nations of their productivity and vitality. But this specific form originates with Lyndon LaRouche, and it's obvious that this is where Haas and Hinkle are getting this idea. I don't know to what extent they believe this literally. I think British is more of a signifier. It's esoteric fascist rhetoric, which allows them to signal their affinity for LaRouche, a fascist cult leader who tried building laser death beams to destroy the USSR. So that's Lyndon LaRouche. But there is yet another major intellectual influence on MAGA communism, one which MAGA communists acknowledge much more openly, and that's Aleksandr Dugin. So let's talk about him. Aleksandr Dugin was born on January 7th, 1962. His father was a colonel in Soviet intelligence, and the details of his earlier life are unclear and contradictory for whatever reason. Dugin began his political activity in the 1980s, first joining a secret group of Moscow intellectuals who dabbled in occult neo-Nazism, which is a great start. One of Dugin's contributions to the group was translating the work of Italian fascist philosopher Julius Ovella, who famously called himself a super-fascist. Later in the 1980s, Dugin moved away from neo-Nazism and toward Russian ultranationalism. He joined the anti-Semitic ultranationalist organization Pamyat and sat on its Central Council. As the Soviet Union approached collapse, Dugin visited the West and made contact with leading figures in the European New Right, and the experience appears to have greatly influenced the development of Dugin's political philosophy. In 1993, he co-founded the National Bolshevik Party, National Socialism, National Bolshevism, MAGA Communism, same shit. Dugin's career as an intellectual took off in the 1990s, particularly with his publication of The Foundation of Geopolitics in 1997, which quickly became influential among Russian nationalists and elite military circles. And his ideology is basically just Russian imperialist nationalism, calling for a vast Russian empire which absorbs all of the former Soviet Union, dominates Europe, and drives the US back to the Western Hemisphere. Western sources are sometimes prone to exaggerating Dugin's influence in Russia and making it sound as though Dugin is writing Russian foreign policy, which he isn't. But Dugin is still a prominent intellectual with a good deal of influence in the Russian political and military establishments. He is a leading intellectual of the ultra-nationalist far right in Russia, which makes it very strange that MAGA communists display such admiration for Dugin. Hinkle and Haas like Dugin. They really, really like Dugin. According to Haas, Marxist theory in the West is meaningless without the insights of Dugin. Jackson Hinkle calls him one of the greatest men alive today, and Haas and Hinkle have conducted gushing interviews with Dugin himself a number of times. This affinity for Dugin goes a long way to explain the multipolarity fixation of MAGA communists. MAGA communists are obsessed with multipolarity, and in their geopolitical stance, they are very radically anti-Western. They present their anti-Westernism as Marxist anti-imperialism, but in fact, it clearly stems from their far-right ideology. They see the liberal West as too woke, and they find ideological kinship with right-wing anti-liberal forces outside the West. Their anti-liberalism is fascist rather than Marxist, hence their adulation of Dugin, who most definitely is not an anti-imperialist thinker. And they mix it with this idea of the British financial cabal ruling the West, and hence their support for Russia and China to fight this international cabal. And Jackson Hinkle lives in Moscow now, apparently permanently. Take from that what you will. However, Haas and Hinkle are also invested in presenting a communist disguise. They claim to be Marxist-Leninist, and they're invested in keeping up this pretense and proclaiming themselves the only true communist organization in America. Openly championing a far-right ultra-nationalist philosopher kind of complicates their efforts to pose as communists, so they just deny that Dugin is a fascist. According to Haas, the idea that Dugin is a fascist is a myth invented by liberals and woke leftists. Dugin is just misunderstood and unfairly maligned, according to Haas. Hinkle also takes a deep offense at anyone who calls Dugin a fascist. Hinkle characterizes Dugin as the foremost philosopher of multipolarity. He's not a fascist, he's a great anti-imperialist thinker. This is helped by the fact that Dugin himself denies that he's a fascist.
And what would be your response to them? That the notion that you are somehow a fascist or adjacent to fascism or something like that?
I reject radically a metaphysical basis of liberalism, individualism, modernity, idea of progress, linear time, and I am not. I reject as well enlightenment in general and modernity, Western modernity, as hegemonic process. So, at the same time, I refuse communism and fascism, and I have written my book, Fourth Political Theory, that clearly stated my position.
So according to Dugin, he isn't a fascist, he just rejects modernity, the idea of progress, and the Enlightenment in an entirely non-fascistic way. Okay, but whether you want to apply the label of a fascist to Dugin's politics, and I think Dugin is definitely a fascist, but setting that aside, even if you dispute that Dugin is a fascist, he is undeniably far-right and ultra-nationalist, and this doesn't look like an ingenious 18D chess synthesis of Dugin's philosophy with Marxism like Haas and Hinkle want to portray. It just looks like two American far-right ultra-nationalists taking inspiration from a Russian far-right ultra-nationalist. Before I wrap up the video, I want to talk about the nature of reactionary politics and how MAGA communism helps us to understand it. Reactionaries have something in common with leftists. They are discontent with the present state of things. They are disenchanted with the status quo. They feel aggrieved and frustrated. They believe that there is something deeply and fundamentally wrong about society. They feel anxious and upset about modern life. They have a sense of disempowerment and subjugation. But they believe that the answer is to return to older social forms. They think restoring some imagined vision of the past is going to solve their problems and the problems of their society. They think the problem is moral and spiritual degeneration, which they define as the subversion and corruption of the dominant culture. And they inevitably develop elaborate conspiracy theories and esoteric mythologies to explain their worldview, because their worldview is devoid of scientific rationality. They think restoring and radically strengthening patriarchal norms, attacking disfavored groups, whether on the basis of ethnicity, religion, gender, or sexuality, eliminating rabble-rousers who divide the culture and nation with ideas like class struggle. They think all of this will rejuvenate society and restore lost glory. Fascism is different from socialism or Marxism in that it isn't really a single ideology as much as a class or collection of ideologies, which are sometimes mutually incompatible. That's because fascism is highly tailored to the particular national context. German National Socialism and Italian fascism were allied to one another, but they had substantial differences which caused some significant tensions, because they were different forms of fascism emerging from different national contexts. The Nazis espoused Aryan superiority in their racial scheme, and this caused tensions with the Italian fascists, because Hitler only considered northern Italians to be strongly Aryan and ranked southern Italians below Aryans. Within the United States, far-right politics has been heavily influenced by Nazism/German National Socialism. Neo-Nazism has been the most prominent ideology on the American far right for decades. The ideology of neo-Nazism today is not the same thing as German National Socialism, even though neo-Nazis overwhelmingly don't acknowledge this. Neo-Nazis tend to have this pan-European racial ideology, whereas German National Socialism very much did not, and was genocidal toward Eastern European populations who today are considered to be just white. And this just shows again how fluid fascist ideology is, how it changes and adapts to the context. A century ago, Eastern Europe was very far behind Western Europe in economic and technological development, so much so that Slavic populations were widely seen as racially inferior in Western Europe, and this fed into Nazi ideology, where the Nazis sought to wipe out most of the region and colonize it with German settlers. But today, Slavs are largely seen as just being white people, equal to any other white people. So neo-Nazis have adapted and just pretend like General Plan Ost never happened. It's this fluid nature of fascism, the way fascist ideology adapts to the context, that we can use to understand what MAGA communism is and its predecessor in LaRoucheism. Lyndon LaRouche did something which I find kind of fascinating. He developed a homegrown form of American fascism. American neo-Nazis, by contrast, have a brand of a fascist ideology which is more imported from Europe, and in the American context, neo-Nazism can't really function as a traditional fascist movement. Today, over 40% of Americans are something besides non-Hispanic white, and Native Americans and Black Americans have been here in significant numbers from the very beginning. It's difficult to get a fascist movement going, which by definition excludes over 40% of the country. Traditional fascist movements were mass movements which sought to mobilize their societies in reactionary, ultranationalist, imperialist projects. The name National Socialism refers to this idea of the national unity of the German people. Not only 60% of the German people, but nearly the whole German people, aside from small, disfavored minorities like Jews. And even though the US is very ethnically diverse, culturally speaking, there is very strong assimilation of almost every group that comes here. The US isn't like the Balkans. The overwhelming majority of US-born citizens speak fluent English and have a common cultural experience. Even the Black American subculture, which is distinct from the mainstream culture in many ways, is recognizably American, and Black Americans have had a huge influence on the general culture. And this is the innovation of Lyndon LaRouche. He developed a homegrown, authentically American form of fascism. His ideology is like National Socialism, but Americanized National Socialism. As I mentioned earlier, LaRouche struggled to form enduring alliances with other far-right groups, because there were many Jews and racial minorities among his followers. LaRouche jettisoned the white ethno-nationalism characteristic of neo-Nazism and suited his form of fascism to the American context. But LaRouche's ideology was still very much fascist. There is some universe out there where conditions were different and LaRouche became the fascist ruler of America, and that universe is horrifying. And this is ultimately what MAGA communism is. It's an Americanized form of fascism with roots in the ideology of Lyndon LaRouche and fused with the ideas of a far-right, ultra-nationalist Russian philosopher. To MAGA communists, America is a country besieged by moral and cultural subversion orchestrated by a shadowy international financial cabal. Americans need to unite across class lines to defeat this cabal, restore traditional values, rejuvenate the country, and engage in vigorous territorial expansion. At the same time, MAGA communists try to don a communist aesthetic to fool people, which also isn't unprecedented in the history of fascist movements. All fascist movements historically have harkened back to an idyllic glory age which needs to be revived. For the Nazis, it was the image of the medieval German peasant, the idea of blood and soil. For the Italian fascists, it was the Roman Empire, whose glory and prestige they wanted to restore. For MAGA communists, I think their nostalgia is really directed toward this idealized conception of the post-war United States from the 1940s to the 1970s, this golden age of prosperity and national harmony, when America was an industrial powerhouse and conservative cultural values reigned supreme, with the strong industrial working man who had the authority over his wife. This vision of the past weighs heavily on the minds of MAGA communists. Now, I do think that the post-war era was better than contemporary America in numerous ways. It really was an era of a broad prosperity and progress relative to now. America was a much more equal society back then. Unions were at their peak, and the balance of power between labor and capital was much more tilted toward labor. The gains of economic growth and productivity were shared much more broadly. Housing was a lot more affordable. It was genuinely a golden age in many ways. But that's not what MAGA communists are focusing on. It's not the social democracy they care about. It's this vision of a culturally conservative and traditional America, an industrial America, the image of the heterosexual, industrial working man patriarch as opposed to the gay female or effeminate barista. This paradise lost and destroyed by sinister powers that be who have corrupted the culture and sapped the nation's productivity. That's really what MAGA communism is.